Why? Why is
excellent timing? Is this our new intro theme?
Hi, Dad. I'm just about to start recording a podcast. Can I give you a ring back in about an hour? All right. Ta-ra. Adios.
That's a dad's prerogative, man.
That's how we're starting this episode now.
Bigger than capes.
Give me some sadness.
Yeah, I was looking forward to it, and then I watched it.
Right.
Hello, welcome to Bigger Than Capes. I'm Zach, and this week I'm joined by Will. How you doing, Will?
Hello. Very good, thanks, buddy. How you doing?
Hey, you know what? I can't complain, really. I mean, I probably can, but who'd listen?
It's always something to complain about.
Oh, yeah. I think I did my fake voice for the starting again now, which is...
Howdy, guys. Welcome to Bigger Than Capes.
I think that's the thing. I start every episode with this kind of radio voice, and then literally right after just drop back to plain old Mank.
Just like Carrie Fisher. And Leia starts a very prim and proper English woman. It just doesn't last. Yeah.
I mean, don't get me wrong. You know, it's not a bad person to take cues from, I suppose.
Absolutely.
So how you been? You been comicking and whatnot? You know,
of course. Yeah, and I'm keeping up with some of the regular series as well as some of the book club series. It's good. I just got such a backlog. I'm just digging, and I'm reading stuff and constantly adding new stuff because I'm a fool.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's the way we live.
It is, isn't it?
Whatever reasons. I think I've been in a place where I keep looking at my bookshelf and all the books I kind of bought recently in sales, and then yesterday I picked up a load more stuff in a sale, and I've just bought more books today online, and then I've started buying more digital stuff because I'm an idiot, and I look at the shelf. I know I've got like 100 unread books on Comixology, and I know I've got like 1,000 unread books on a shelf, and I'm still like, but it's not the book I don't want to read right now. That's the thing. It's like by the time the books I've ordered arrived, normally I'm like, oh yeah, I really wanted to read that yesterday, but today.
I used to do it all the pre Netflix and otherwise streaming TV. I used to do it all the time with DVDs. It's like hit up HMV, hit the bargain bin, buy a load of fucking B movies that I thought looked fun, take them home, and then by the time I'd taken like the train journey home, I thought, I don't care about these. They're just going to stay in their cellophane forever.
It's weird because I imagine you're very similar to me. I used to go to Manchester like every week, and back in the day when like FOP and HMV and Music Zone did CDs for like $5, would like chain buy CDs and DVDs and go home and be super into like the Flaming Lips for 4 hours and then not listen to them again for 6 months.
Ever again. I found like I made a conscious decision to stop like pirating stuff fairly early on when like LimeWire was still a thing. And it was because I'm a big fan of Elvis Costello, but I downloaded his entire discography and then just didn't know where to start. You're like, I've got like, I don't know, 12 albums or something here. At some point you think it's just too much. It's too much, and your brain just tells you that it's unachievable. So
yeah, I think I had a similar thing with Bob Dylan when I was in college. Like I studied music, like recording and performance and production stuff in college, and every tutor we had was like, yeah, Bob Dylan's like the man. And I was like, okay, yeah, Bob Dylan does have some good stuff. And I like remember looking up a list of every album Bob Dylan had, and there's like, so 10 years ago now there were like 30-40 Bob Dylan albums.
He just released anything he ever thought about, and sometimes it'd get released late but it still came out, and I'm like, yeah man, I'm gonna go buy some Bob Dylan albums. And I distinctly remember being like, which ones? They're all meant to be incredible in their own special way. Yeah, I've never been much of a Dylan fan myself, but it's that for comic books. And I guess when you're a fan of something that's relatively niche like comics, particularly some of the comics that we read are not high run numbers. I don't know why you'd ever want to steal it. Like, the fact is, I want people to keep making these things, and the only way they're going to keep making them is if they can feed themselves while doing it. So I'm all for finding a sale or getting a good price, but I don't understand. If you like it, why pirate it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things I'm a sucker for buying everything, and I think particularly with the amount of indie books we're into, there's a certain kind of, yeah, man, but what if it falls out of print before I bought all the volumes?
And so many things that don't get past a volume 1, like, that just don't get the sales. And I think I was listening to another podcast. Others are available, but I wouldn't recommend them. About like, in fact, it was about Bad Idea.
Oh yeah.
And they were asked, like, what do you think about pirating comics? Because if you're going to sell your comics in only selected stores and only physical, somebody's going to put it online, right? Somebody's going to scan a book and they kind of pointed out that there's actually like hundreds of thousands of illegal downloads, so that like comic books are read by tons more people than I think the statistics suggest. It's just a huge proportion of those people aren't turning up on stats because they're not buying them from anywhere.
Yeah, and how do you factor in the illegal download market?
How do you deal with that? And I think it's a real shame, because I think if all of those people decided to buy the books they read, I think comics would be a big industry.
Yeah, I don't get me wrong, it is a semi-big industry.
Yeah, and I mean the fact that even Hellboy gets a film, and you were now seeing stuff like Old Guard and Jeff Lemire.
Yeah, getting out all the Jeff Lemire apparently in the next year or so,
producing stuff, which I think is great. Like that, these things are getting a wider audience. But I know so many people who like watch or read sci-fi, fantasy, crime stuff, and I just think that there are so many comics you'd really like.
Yeah,
but I just don't think they can get over the fact that it's a comic like that.
I think it's definitely true. I've had that with, I think, from friends to family members to just about everyone, where it's like, well, if you're into this, you probably really like comics, but you don't want comics for reasons I can't fully comprehend, even though here we are. I don't know.
There it is. We like it, and it's good stuff. So
that's right.
But talking of
all hours, apparently.
Yeah. But talking of Master Lemire.
Yeah, good segue.
Thank you.
His recent newsletter has information, much of it really. It's a pretty... Every time he puts out a newsletter, I'm kind of surprised by how much he has to say.
Yeah, he seems to save them up until he's got a good fist of information, and then punches you right in the old chops with it. Yeah,
so he's basically... And I don't know if this is the angle you were going to take to begin with, but let's find out. He's basically said that everything is kind of finishing right about now, or has already finished.
Yeah, I think he said Sweet Tooth has basically wrapped up filming on it, I think.
Yeah, and Sweet Tooth, The Return, the comic as well, has also, the last issue comes out, I think came out this week, maybe?
Okay, I missed that in his rundown, but that is fine. Essex County, I think the bulk of the scripts are written, so he says that might be a way off yet.
Yeah.
Oh boy, that's a story laden with sweet misery.
Delicious sweet misery. Perfection.
But some of the bits I'm really looking forward to is working again with Gabriel Walter, Dustin Nguyen, and Andrea Sorrentino from several of his excellent series to date. Yeah,
there's some real cool things there. I think Sentient was a really good graphic novel, and I've obviously loved Descender and Ascender, so I'm looking forward to seeing both of those continued like creative relationships and seeing what the future might hold.
But I think the bit I'm most excited about is the slight changes to some of his Black Hammer universe.
Yes,
So
definitely.
I think we're getting the last of the kind of extended universe books in Madame Dragonfly.
Yeah.
And then everything should come down to Black Hammer Reborn and sort of consolidate down to a single story.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I think I've liked the extended universe vibe, but I think the kind of separation from the core characters at times and the farm, obviously, since that's wrapped up and we've seen like individual stories from those characters, it has felt like it's missing a bit of a focal point at times, I think.
Yeah, I think we spent quite a long time learning who everybody is through often really entertaining like side stories, but I think you're right, it's felt like that's all they ever were.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I think like Quantum Age, I think is one of my favorite bits of Black Hammer. But then I miss Abe.
Yeah. I really like the Dr. Sherlock Frankenstein spin-off. Yes. I think is pretty excellent. I don't know. I just like his universe, and they feel, well, I mean, they are, aren't they? Golden Age.
Like kind of Golden Age, Silver Age
sort of spins. But I'm always fine with that. Like, I've got no problem. It's what he does with them, I think, and the journeys he takes them on. That I love Black Hammer.
Yeah, I think Black Hammer has been some of my favourite Lemire, particularly in superhero Lemire. I distinctly remember reading the first trade and then being like, right, well, I can't wait the 12 months it's going to take Dark Horse to give me the second trade of this book. So I'm going to have to read it in singles, which obviously made it worse because...
Yeah, it doesn't feel... As I think back on it now, I don't think of it in like chapter chunks. It doesn't feel like a book written for the single issue necessarily.
Yeah, I think it works a lot better. And I'm kind of looking forward to... I haven't bought them yet because of the aforementioned pile of comics, but they're doing like these hardcover library editions of so the Farm, Age of Doom, and then like the World of Black Hammer, collecting all the spin-off series together. And I think that's probably going to be the best way to read it, in like one massive chunk of Black Hammer goodness.
Hells yeah. But yeah, very much looking forward to more of that, and that Sweet Tooth TV series.
Yeah, I think Sweet Tooth is an interesting one for adaptation. I think I've always said that it's almost a zombie story without the zombies.
Yeah, it's the post-apocalyptic world that sort of says the menace isn't the disease or the zombies, it's the people who are left.
Yeah.
So it's not an entirely like original concept. I think even in comics, that is pretty much what The Walking Dead is. And we've seen it in other stuff, other kind of post-apocalyptic gangs coming up, Mad Max, etc.
Yeah.
But I think it's just positing the main character as this sort of mutant young boy who has lived completely off the grid up until his life, and seeing him see this world for the first time as the reader, I think is what elevates it. Like it following young Sweet Tooth as he kind of navigates his way through this disaster world is just so good.
It is. It's such a good series, and I think it's going to make a real good show. In kind of contrast to that, though, I think Essex County, I really don't know how you make a show out of just Canadian sadness, but...
it's odd as well that it's broken down into 3 relatively distinct stories that do broadly connect to each other through the odd kind of character or taking place in the same. How you do that as a TV series, whether you layer those on top of each other, so you're telling all three concurrently, or each series is one story. I don't know. It's a weird book in which not a lot happens in terms of kind of beats of plot.
Yeah, and whilst it is an incredibly good read, I kind of don't know how that becomes a TV show. If that, and
a little bit like some of his other work, like Underwater Welder.
Yes,
as well. It's just all about like mood and style, and because he's drawn them himself, it's just 100% Lemire. Just sort of saying a bit about who he is, I think, and where he's come from. How that translate onto a TV screen, I don't yet know, but I kind of feel like there are, so between like that world of stories like Underwater Welder and Essex County, Royal City, Roughneck, Frog Catchers, I feel like they've all very similar in style and subject matter and tone, and I can kind of see like shuffling them all together and making like, I guess, almost an anthology show. And hey, maybe that's what we're going to get. Maybe we're going to get like a bunch of little stories that are just sort of under the umbrella of Essex County, and then
and maybe that's the thing. Maybe I'm thinking that there's going to be some wider, broad spread connection, but in reality, it can just be half an hour or an hour focusing on sad kids in Canada. And I do mean that in the best possible way. I think I love almost every Jeff Lemire book.
Yeah. I've not read a lot of his kind of Marvel and DC stuff, but the bits I have always been good. But in terms of his creator-owned work, it's just a name I always look out for. Like every time he's doing something new, it's definitely worth checking out. Yes,
definitely. I have another thing from someone else's newsletter. So Rom V's recent newsletter largely talks about kind of obviously DC Future State, which is happening right now, which, we're not the most DC focused, and it's already going to have happened by the time this podcast airs. So the other thing that intrigues me more, he's been announced that himself and Anand RK, who he did Graffiti's Wall and Blue and Green with, are going to be doing a Vault title this year.
Lovely stuff.
And I'm kind of, there's been no details kind of given to it, but when I interviewed him last year for that other podcast we used to do that time, he talked about 2 books that were coming up in the future, and one of them was Mecha Kaiju Romance.
I'm listening.
And the other was about a post-apocalyptic radio station.
Okay, both sound rad.
Yeah, and I can't remember. He definitely said one of them was with the artist from Graffiti's Wall and Blue and Green. I'm sure he did. So I'm hoping it's one of those, because they both sound awesome in weird, different ways.
Very cool concepts.
So I'm all for Apocalypse Radio and Mecha Kaiju rom-com.
Heck yeah. Let me ask you, with having talked about some of the White Noise stuff earlier, I think there's kind of a modern crop of writers who at least appear to do one-run stories.
Yes.
Kind of one trade, 4 to 6 issue stories, and then move on to something else. How do you feel about that compared to, like, would you want Rom V to sit down and do like a 60 issue, or not necessarily Rom V, but like, I feel we get a lot, particularly out of some of the new TKO Vault, tend to be one trade stories, and that's your lot. Do you like that, or would you?
I think it's something that I do actually think about quite a lot at the moment. For whatever reasons, and I've been thinking about it in terms of non-comic book writers I like. So, okay, he's my go-to example, and I need to have other examples on hand. But Stephen King,
Sure, Dean Koontz.
Why the hell not Dean Koontz?
Basically, Stephen King 2.0.
So I've been into Stephen King since I was like most Stephen King readers, since I was too young to read Stephen King.
Sure, yeah.
So since the age of, like, I don't know, 13 probably, I've been reading Stephen King books, and most of the time he just writes a novel and that's the end of it, and we're not going to talk about those characters unless they made a cameo somewhere else. And then obviously there's Dark Tower, which is 8 books of interconnected mental fantasy with nods to all of his other work along the way. And I guess I've kind of thought that it's weird, isn't it, that we expect from comic writers for them to do just the Dark Towers, and we expect the Shining and the Salem's Lot and Pet Sematary to be, every now and again you get to do a 6-issue run, but really we need 4 years of your life to be.
And I think a lot of the times, like, the ideas that these writers are trying to put across would just be diluted if you make it longer. Like, all you'd end up doing is just filling in little action beats just to stretch it out for another 20 pages or so.
So in answer to the question you actually asked, I think I'm kind of into the self-contained graphic novel single volume thing. I like it when people have got big plans and big interconnected, like, long-term storytelling, but in recent years, and to refer to something we talked about before, I think, like, Brian K. Vaughan, I really like Paper Girls, but I also like that it's 6 volumes. I like that Descender is 6 volumes.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be 8 volumes when you include Ascender, which is, like, you know, the sequel, epilogue, whatever. But I think while even in long runs, I'm kind of happy for them to be quite contained. It scares me when Brian K. Vaughan says that Saga's 9 volumes in and he's not even halfway. It's like, Brian, that makes me feel like Saga's going to outlive me.
I think the truth of it is the story should be as long as it sort of needs to be, and that's completely unquantifiable. Sometimes it does need to be, you know, like 60 issues. Sometimes 6 is enough. Yeah,
and I mean, what about you? Are you a single trade kind of man, or are you a...
I do quite like, because I'm a creature of variety, so I like to bounce from one thing to another pretty quickly. So I like that idea that you get the story, you read it, you enjoy it, but then that goes to one side and you've got another one to read. I get bored of stuff quite easily, so if I were to do a full read through of something, even something I love like Chew, within about 3 volumes I'd be thinking, I want to read something else for a bit.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think the shorter runs, or the 1 volume or anything like that, kind of promotes the rereading of that book, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, talking about Ron V, The Savage Shores.
Yes.
Not only is it a self-contained story, I think it benefits from a reread as well. Like, I got so much more out of it the second time, despite loving it the first time.
I think there's things, particularly in something like These Savage Shores, that it's so layered and there's so much you miss that first time.
But if that was volume 1 of 20 and I was at 18, I wouldn't go back and read 1.
No,
even
not
if it was
not
the
easily.
same book.
Don't worry, I know there is stuff that we are into that's quite, like, all right, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Hells yeah.
Is, what are we on now? Like,
We got past the 100 mark, haven't we?
And I can't even think what that is in trades. Are we like 20 trades in now or something insane?
We might need to cut that. I don't know. I lost you there for about 2 seconds.
That's okay. There's like 100 issues of Turtles, and that's what, like 20 volumes or something, because they're like 4-issue volumes.
there or thereabouts, plus all of the side volumes, the crossovers, the single character like mini volumes. Don't get me wrong, like I think that run is equally as guilty as like Marvel or DC for their obnoxious number of spin-offs, but it is one of the most consistently entertaining like comics I read.
Yeah, and I mean, IDW are quite guilty of it. So Turtles, Transformers, My Little Pony, Ghostbusters, G.I. Joe, you name it, they've gone like deep. And there's only one starting point for most of these things, and it's the first bit. And okay, I know Turtles have recently done TMNT Reborn, and they're kind of back to Volume 1, and Transformers have done that as well. But yeah, I feel like even with the indie series that are like 100 issues deep,
yeah,
I don't know if I would go back and read the first. I mean, currently right now I am reading Turtles from the beginning, so clearly I am that guy who will go back to the beginning and read.
I will do it sometimes. I did it with Valiant. It's like every time I'd buy a new trade, I'd normally go a trade or two back and sort of read it as a continuous thing. But there's a limit. There's always a limit.
Yeah, and I think with Valiant, it kind of often rewards you by the fact that it's only 4 issues per trade normally. And I did it with Exo Manowar, the Matt Kint run, where there were 3 issue trades, and every time I would kind of read a little bit more and read all of, and until there was a point where it's like, man, I've read Exo Manowar a lot
of times, yeah. And there is, you can overdo it as well. Just like, I don't ever want to see this again now.
But I do think it does, yeah, particularly with something like Valiant, it kind of pays for itself by like, yeah, you reread it and it makes Matt Kint's later storytelling in Exo or Ninjak make more sense, and you think, oh my god, yeah, this all was building to this all along. Matt Kint's a genius.
Yeah, but I also think it is a little bit obnoxious to your fandom to go, to enjoy this at its fullest, go and spend £100 on these like other volumes to get back up to speed. And the Ninja Turtles are, again, equally as culpable of that. But I also think they do a really good job of each trade, each story, like arc, feeling like a fairly independent arc.
Yeah, I feel like whilst numerically there's only one jumping on point for Turtles, you can read random miniseries, and some of them have got value away from the main story, and there are jumping on points that aren't the start, kind of.
Yeah.
But I also think the single volume, the graphic novel, the 6-issue run is a great way to get people into comics. Mm-hmm. I think if you've got a friend who wants to get into comics and you tell them, well, there's 70 issues of Sandman.
Yeah, that's a hard sell, isn't it?
I think people feel intimidated sometimes when they look at comics. I know when I was younger and looking at and studying Forbidden Planet, staring blindly at Marvel and DC, it was like, I don't know what the start of Batman is.
Yeah, and that of the 2 companies which have the most recognizable like intellectual property in comic books, if you just want to go and read some Batman, it's real hard to know what to buy. Yeah,
you shouldn't have to do like extensive research to choose which Batman book is right for you.
Yeah. I guess I kind of see it that your monthly or your long-term storytelling is kind of my version of a soap opera. I like to just kind of check back in on these characters and see what adventures they're up to, and then I can step away from something like Turtles and then come back to it in 3 months' time. But the single trade things are like films, essentially.
Yeah, that's a good way of seeing it.
And I often think the very best stuff that I read tends to be in that relatively limited format, i.e. that all the best ideas and writing have come down and have been edited to this like 6-issue story. There's no fat on it, and it's perfect. Yet, you just need some of that like idiot food sometimes, don't you? Just something which is real easy to digest. The heroes win, the bad guys lose, everybody's happy, and you don't have to look outside your window and realize that we live in a disaster.
I think that's a valid point, and yeah, it is nice every now and again to have the easy superhero world. Even though they're often much darker and bleaker than our own.
Yeah.
On that bombshell, should we talk about the book that we're here to discuss?
Let's talk about the specific book we're here to talk about.
But before we do, let's talk about our sponsor.
A word from our sponsor.
Our sponsor, as you may or may not know, is Travelling Man. They're based in Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, and York. And that's where I bought Heathen. I don't know about you.
Not on this occasion.
Well,
that's
here we go.
That's not very good, is it? Yes, that's where I got it too.
So they sell comics, graphic novels, manga, board games, RPGs, CCGs.
Everything you'd need for Geek Haven. Roll some dice, flick some cards, read a comic.
Whatever you need to do. Obviously, we're in lockdown right now here in sunny Manchester, England. They're operating online at travellingman.com, where you can go to pick up all manner of nerdery. Still trying to make nerdery happen.
Yeah, working with it.
Hashtag make nerdery happen. So yeah, a lot of love for Travelling Man. Go hit them up.
If you like the sound of Heathen, go get it from there. Yeah,
because they probably still got it. Providing I didn't buy the only one. I don't know. There's 4 shops. Move around. Look more. Try harder. So Heathen then. So Heathen is by Natasha Alterici and Rachel Deering. So Rachel Deering is the letterer and Natasha Alterici is the writer and artist. And
yeah,
I believe this was one of your picks for Manchester Comic Book Club.
It was
Why,
one of my
Will?
picks. I remember when it came out was it part of the first wave of Vault?
Yeah, this is the first Vault book I was aware of, I think.
And I think I was and still am really excited by the prospect of this out of nowhere publisher that just had these like 5 or 6 books ready to go, another sort of raft planned. All of their books were really in my wheelhouse as well. It's all that fancy sci-fi, occasional horror, which is not normally my kind of jam, but I think all of their stuff just looks good. It looks at a really high quality. A bit like when we've talked about TKO in the past, they got a mix of kind of well-known names and a few people who were not known, at least to me. But Heathen just stood out as one of those books in that first wave that just really caught my eye, and I thought this looks absolutely top.
Yeah, I agree. I distinctly remember when I worked at the aforementioned Travelling Man that there was a couple of customers, one of which was Angela, who were getting Heathen.
Parish.
Yeah, who were picking up Heathen, and we never seemed to get it like enough of it, and it always looked super cool, but I never got to read Heathen. So yeah. I'm glad that I finally got around to it. So good call.
Excellent. I think it's worth noting, as you did in the Manchester Comic Club, that Rachel Deering is the first letterer who gets equal like namespace on the front of a book as the writer artist. So fair play.
Yeah, it's kind of cool, isn't it? Because it's normally like, here's the writer and here's the artist, and everyone else involved gets their name in tiny letters at the bottom of the cover if they're lucky.
Mm-hmm.
They're unlucky, they don't even make the cover.
No, but Rachel Deering gets it there, right on the front.
Which, that's kind of nice. It's
good for her.
Yeah, I'm glad people get credit for things. It's good, isn't it, when people actually get credit for the work that they do.
It's good stuff, yeah. Do you want a little quick synopsis?
Hey, if you've got one, by all means. Okay.
So, you'll have to fill in some of the gaps that I've missed, but this is the story of Adis.
Yes.
And are we agreed?
Adis, yeah, I think Adis is the way I'm going.
a Viking, sort of a female Viking warrior who has been cast out of her tribe, I guess, by having a kiss with another woman. Liv. Her father was then ordered to either marry her off or execute her, and instead of killing her, took her out to the woods, set her off on her way. And now Adis's mission is to free Brynhild, the ex-leader of the Valkyries, from a curse set on her by Odin. Basically, in order to prove that women are as capable as any man within this particular kind of society. And then along the way, some other gods start to get involved.
As Viking stories often.
They're always nosy, the old Norse pantheon.
Just love getting involved in the goings on of humans, don't they?
They do.
It's always the shtick. Don't get me wrong, I'm okay with that. I think the first god we get is Riordan. Riordan. Who I actually don't know, which that was nice. Surprise gods are nice.
It was nice. I mean, we get name checked with Odin. We see Freya later on. But I did like that there were some kind of lesser popularized bits of Norse mythology in there, like Skull and Hearty, the two wolves that eat the sun and the moon at Ragnarok, were excellent. But I like that it touches on some of those, I guess, slightly lesser known bits that Marvel has told people about.
I do feel like, no offense to them, but Marvel have really hammered Thor and Loki. I've just realized what I did there. To death. It's like they really hammered the fact home that this is Norse mythology and this is what you get, and it's all Thor all the time.
Yeah, and they're the most important elements of it. But I think, like the Greek pantheon, I think it's a pretty rich kind of tapestry of characters and stories, and it's nice to see somebody tackling a different angle of it, I think.
Yeah, and in some ways a more grounded kind of version, I guess.
It sits in that odd place that sometimes this kind of indie comic does, where it neither fully accepts that it's a kind of fantasy story, despite the fact that there are literal gods and curses and magic, and yet also refuses to say that it's like a complete reality, sort of fictional historical telling of what the life would be like as for a Norse woman.
Yeah,
it rides that line without ever really committing to either one fully. And I think in this case it really works, because it makes it easy to accept that these gods walk the earth, because the people are equally just like, oh shit, there's a god.
Yeah, it's an interesting blending of the two, like everyday Norse with the mythological Norse, I guess, which isn't something we see. I mean, okay, there are examples like early on in Jason Aaron's like God of Thunder run on Thor, we kind of see that, past Earth bits of Thor before he's worthy, which have got more of the, hey, he's a god, but he's slumming it with the Earthlings.
Yeah.
But I feel like this feels more natural. It doesn't feel like someone trying to do a superhero book in the past. This feels like somebody just trying to create a world where magic was still alive and well on Earth and the gods weren't that far away.
I think forever the problem is that in something like the Marvel stories, if you write a history of Thor now, you're writing it after an already like 70 years history. So anything you do now will be retcon.
Yeah.
No matter what, because everything you do that's before now, like we've seen a good chunk of it. So
I guess one of my thick problems with things is anytime Marvel or DC have kind of got their claws into very public domain concepts like Norse mythology or Greek mythology for that matter, and have kind of gone, this is ours now. We tell the stories about Norse mythology, guys. I always feel like it's kind of paints this picture of the comics world that if you're going to do Norse mythology, it's in the frame of a modern superhero, which...
Do you know, I am very interested in reading that I've never got round to, but was Walt Simonson's, is it just called Norse Mythology? And
I think so.
With IDW, I think, and just this idea of the person who is considered one of the two, like, greatest Thor scribes.
Yeah,
I would have said between him and Aaron, probably.
Yeah, I think they're pretty up there.
Has gone off and done his own like set of stories. Intrigues me.
I think it might be called Ragnarok. I think it's Walt Simonson's Ragnarok.
So we're still obviously going to get plenty of Thor and Odin and whatnot, but that's interesting to see what he's done outside of the constraints after what he did within the constraints, which arguably is some of the better, Thor stuff ever written.
That is my criticism, is that unfortunately I think Marvel have staked their claim to Norse mythology, and it's nice to see someone break away and do something. And obviously we've seen other people do Norse mythology books, Walt Simonson being an example. Neil Gaiman's book is being adapted to comics at the moment, and other such examples is there's something at the moment that's like a quarterly being done by the artist who did Powers. I can't think what it was called. I feel like I want to say it was like Ragnarok Quarterly, but it's not. It's that would be an absurd name, wouldn't it?
Yeah. But I guess the point being there, I think this takes a both fresh and kind of authentic look at Norse mythology and kind of livelihood of the people who lived there. Of all of the characters, I mean, it's a pretty 50-50 split between those that are genuinely like mythological and those that are just people. And you get to see this world through both of their eyes, I think.
Yeah, and I think we walk that fine line. So when we find spoiler, Brynhild, we kind of hear the backstory that she has been saved previously, and she's kind of doomed that whoever saves her, she marries, and once they die, she goes back to being imprisoned. And most recently, 300 years ago, she was saved by Sigurd, I think, yeah. Sigurd, who, after saving her, was then duped into being made immortal, which means they couldn't be together, and she was imprisoned again. And it's kind of interesting because it's that kind of meeting ground immediately of human with God
powers but human problems.
Yeah. That's a good way of putting it, which it's interesting, and it shows the kind of spectrum of characters you can have whilst using the supernatural and gods, and speaks a lot of relationships, I think, and we kind of get a quite broad spectrum of sexuality and representation amongst the characters we get here, which is nice.
I think it's inclusive of part of the story, I think, without it ever becoming sort of obnoxious as a storytelling tool. I don't think there's any time that I feel Natasha Alterici is kind of battering you over the head. I think she delivers the message really well in a way that is a connective tissue to an otherwise like entertaining story.
Yes,
but still has that depth to kind of have a message. But I've just read some things sometimes where I think the message has taken precedent over the story. And at the end of it, you can think, well, I know what you were going for, but damn, it was boring. It sucked to get there. And I think Heathen really, I think it rides that line so far.
Yeah, I think it's nice to see a message told organically in a story rather than feeling like the story is a vehicle for just the message. It's
Absolutely, yeah.
It's nice that it's kind of mutual meeting ground between the two. And I've said meeting ground about 1,000 times in this episode already, I think.
Just got to look up a thesaurus and edit in some different words.
Not going to happen, Will. But equally, whilst I think it's quite well written and the structure of the characters we get is really nicely put together and it's an interesting cast of characters, I think Natasha Alterici's art is like real good. I don't know what your stance is on real good art, but
yeah, no, I think it's both art that suits its subject matter, obviously, because she has both written and drawn.
Yeah, she's got a pretty good hold on what she was going for, I think.
But for somebody whose work I am admittedly not very knowledgeable about, yeah, I thought her art was awesome. Like from the actual kind of character depiction. Sometimes you get close-up faces, and they're often quite angular and detailed. To sometimes being quite caricature, where you might see background faces that just have a big O for a mouth and big eyes when something shocking has happened.
Yeah, it kind of borders between like European comic feels and then like manga feels for some of the background detail.
A little bit, and it gives it a kind of levity as well that it just makes it a much more nicer like reading experience. Something that did come up in the meeting,
yes,
was that the art does seem to kind of change between the first two and the latter two issues.
Yeah, and we kind of had varying opinions on if it was an intentional move or if it was a natural improvement of art as
well. That's the question of improvement as well, because I think me and I think perhaps Matt as well were in agreement that I think the first two issues are better. I think there's more detail, and although the art is scratchier and I think the line work gets tighter later on, I think the art in the first two issues is more expressive and a bit more creative. My theory then being is that I think as the series maybe got more popular and time restraints came in, I think she probably had to simplify the art.
And I think backgrounds kind of get more vague.
I think she relies a lot on the colouring, which a lot of it has that. I'm not sure if it is genuine watercolours or if it's a computer effect. Who knows? But it's definitely got that kind of style into it of a pastel-y, watercolour-y thingamabob.
Yeah, no, it's definitely got a kind of watercolor ink drawing kind of vibe, which I am very into. And yeah, it's interesting. I would kind of like to know if it's digital or if it is hand drawn with ink.
But one of our other comic book club members, new member Alex, had the theory that the art gets more kind of tight. The line work gets more specific whenever we're in the presence of gods.
Yeah,
and then is rougher when they're not around.
Which could very well be true, and
it's a nice theory. I'm not entirely convinced yet. I'd have to read more, but if it is an active choice, then that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and maybe it is and maybe it isn't, and there are a lot of reasons that your art can kind of change between issues, I guess. But even though it does change from being kind of scratchier ink drawing at the start to more smooth and streamlined with less detail in the backgrounds, I do think throughout it is good artwork and it is art that I like a lot. I think characters are just really well done. I
think almost any criticism is going to be like nitpicking.
Yeah, and I'm just going to say it. Skull and Hearty.
Hearty, yeah.
Just two damn good-looking wolves.
Right. And to be honest, between that and Saga the Talking Horse, like you've got me hands down there.
Yeah, they've got some of my favourite moments in this book quite comfortably, and I think I could have almost taken a book that was just talking Norse mythology animals.
Yeah, as they argue over which one's going to eat the sun, which one's going to eat the moon, because the moon tastes horrible and the sun's really delicious. It's just it's good stuff.
And so throughout the book, we kind of see, obviously, the initial kind of saving of Brynhild, and then Odin as this ominous lurking threat that we don't actually see in person. We see Freya as kind of... Freya's interesting because she's kind of the bad guy for a bit, but also not entirely bad, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's that element that we're seeing the story from kind of Adis's point of view, and her point of view is probably quite tiny compared to that of the gods. You know, her ideal of good and bad, and what we see as good and bad is probably quite transient for... I mean, they even talk about, don't they, this idea of cycles, and that it all just happens over and over again.
Yeah.
But Adis represents a kind of a slight change in the cycle, and that's why they're all so interested in checking out what she's doing. But yeah, I think Freya is played off as a bit of a bad guy. She has taken over as head of the Valkyries from Brynhild since she's been in her incarceration. But yeah, as you get to know a bit more about Freya, I think her position is much more complicated than just being the bad.
Yeah.
And as you said,
so go on.
You don't actually get to see Odin yet in this book. But I've got the feeling, on the way that Natasha Alterici has written her other characters, is that Odin, I think, will be equally as complicated. I don't think he's going to just play off as a one-eyed dickhead.
Yeah, I think... Sorry, I can't get past one-eyed dickhead. I think there's going to be a lot more depth to Odin than perhaps we're expecting, and that's I think that's only ever going to be a good thing. I think giving extra depth to gods, makes quite a lot of sense. Actually, I think
it's infinitely more interesting when you have a antagonist who is at least some way like sympathetic.
Yeah, very much so. I think it's difficult to have a villain that is pure bad and kind of have an objective view of them. I think you need that like nuance.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word I'm going with.
Yeah, but I think that's true in the wider comics as well. Like Lex Luthor is an interesting character because his stance isn't always just "I'm evil." It's normally like this fear of what Superman represents for humanity, and it gives him a depth that, I don't know, someone like the Red Skull just doesn't. He's just a Nazi, isn't he? And he's always just a Nazi, and sometimes he's a Nazi with cosmic powers, but there's no sympathy for the Red Skull, and for me, that makes him a pretty dry bad guy.
Yeah, Red Skull isn't the most deep at times. I think
Kite Man, there's a villain.
Kite Man, there's a villain with layers.
Hell yeah.
Have you seen the Harley Quinn? We're so off topic. Have you seen the Harley Quinn animated series?
I have not. No.
Kite Man's there and it's good. That's all
That's all I need. I'm buying it now.
It's real good, real good. But I enjoyed Heathen a lot, and I am kind of looking forward to seeing where the series can go. I think it's only 12 issues, 3 volumes, so I'm kind of looking forward to what we're going to see. And I think we've had some great, badassery from Adis, some interesting tortured love stories between Sigurd and Brynhild. And I think there's just a lot to kind of sink your teeth into and want more of. I almost feel like volume 1 could afford to be longer. Although I do think it's a pretty solid cliffhanger.
I think it leaves it at a really good place to keep you excited for volume 2. I think if I were to criticize the book in terms of its kind of plotting, it does feel like this book is a lot of setup.
Yeah, it's very establishing.
Yeah, and I think although there are payoffs within the story itself, I don't think it's not yet made it clear really what the real thrust of the story is.
Yeah.
When you start the story, the mission seems to be save Brynhild. Well, again, spoiler alert, that happens.
That's only issue 1, yeah.
Exactly. And then you think, well, I don't really know what the main direction of this is going to be yet. As it happens, the writing and the art and the characters, again, like Skull and Hattie, get a kind of introductory moment, and then you think, oh, we need to see them again later. There's got to be a point where these guys pop back up. There's enough there for me to be excited for more, but I do think like it doesn't quite give enough.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of world building. We kind of see the Norse mythology and the Norse gods kind of being chased off almost a little bit by the input of Christianity in the southern.
That's a nice touch as well. Getting a bit of real history in there.
Yeah, and I think the explanation when she adds the horns to the helmet, because that's how they're being described, as these kind of demons.
Yeah.
That's how the Christians are depicting them, as heathens and demons, is like that's a nice touch. And
yeah, and she's decided to lean into it.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, if you're being described as demons anyway, run with it. But yeah, in a kind of interesting world building narrative, I think there's some really cool ideas. The idea of the cycles, the idea of how the gods interact with humans, the idea of how humans interact with humans. We see the witch in issue 3, who's kind of being ran out of town by planned to be but ran out of town / we're going to burn her at the stake by everyone else in the town, who's then saved by Brynhild. I think we see like a great deal of information quite quickly about the world we're in.
Yeah, that gives you a good picture of what your general populace's like viewpoints are. But again, it's a situation that is solved with a kind of compassion and understanding for the most part. And again, refreshing to see as where you could tell this kind of tale in a Marvel book, but ultimately somebody's going to get hit with a hammer and that's going to resolve the plot. As where this was a more emotional engagement, I think, than one of action, but it plays off really well and it reads really well, and it's equally as entertaining as a bit of Biff, Bam and Wallop.
Biff, Bam and Wallop.
Yeah,
beautiful.
That's my spin-off podcast.
Let me know how that works out for you. But yeah, I agree with you. I think this year I'm probably going to read volumes 2 and 3 of Heathen. I think quite comfortably.
Oh, yeah.
I want to see how this turns out.
Yeah, I'm not going to sleep on this very long. I will get these. And I think, again, as we were saying earlier, the fact that we know it is 12 issues and that it's finished makes me so much more ready to invest in it than something of just like, it's indefinitely long and Christ, it might never actually come to fruition. Just knowing 3 volumes, I can do that.
Yeah, and I am interested to see what else Natasha Alterici is going to do. In kind of the preparation to book club, I checked out a series that's only 2 issues on Comixology, which is called Illustrated Girl, that she did the art for. I'm not going to go into the full pitch for it, but I think the art is very scratchy ink drawing and not as refined as the art is in Heathen. She didn't write it, so it's her art but not her writing. And I know I've read her contribution to Gotham Academy from a few years ago. I think she did one of the yearbook like one-shot type thingies. You're welcome. Yeah. But I think she is an interesting writer and artist that I do want to see more of in the future, and I'm kind of curious where she's going to pop up. I'd like to see if she's got, another Vault title planned or...
I think it's impressive that she's managed to carve out her own quite unique story in a world that has been so heavily done in comics. And you're right, it's of that caliber that I'm just interested to see what she does now. I'd happily follow Natasha Alterici around wherever she chooses to kind of publish her next book and see what's what.
Yeah, I completely agree.
I say it might be nice if she could go somewhere and produce one of these one volume books. I'd be interested to see what she can do in 6 issues or.
Yeah, and I know she's done. So she did a series called The Wilds with Vita Ayala at Black Mask, so she did the art but not the writing. And I guess after this, I'm interested to see what she can do as a writer and artist rather than just one.
It'd be interesting to see what she does as just a writer as well as somebody else.
Yeah,
comes in as an artist and seeing how she copes with that. How her stories work when it's not her accompanying art.
Yeah, that is a good point. It's something I think that we'll have to keep an eye out for on both sides
for the future. I saw podcast favorite Liefeld.
Oh yeah.
He made some spurious comment about all of the best comic writers were all in the past. So the best comic writers only existed really between the 60s and the 80s, and that's proven by the fact that we constantly hark back to these old stories. I just think you've just not been reading the right books, because there are a huge spate, including the White Noise guys and your Brian K. Vaughns and numerous other people who are just churning out excellent top tier comics.
I'm not going to go into the full thing, but there are various rants available from me in previous podcasts about how I think people only hark back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s in comics because 100% of people trying to get someone else into comics completely ignore modern comics. And if you ask someone, hey, I want to get into comics, what should I read? People go, oh, you should read The Dark Knight Returns and Watchmen. And you absolutely should not.
That should be your first port of call.
It's always bugged me because I've had friends who were quite happily getting into DC through Bombshells or Batwoman and get recommended stuff like, oh, if you want to get into DC, you should read Watchmen. And it's no, that's like saying, if you want to get into boxing, you should watch Rocky. It's Rocky's great and it tells you a little bit about boxing, but ultimately it's got nothing to do with the sport, much like Watchmen doesn't tell you anything about DC Comics.
No. And I think we get a lot of that, don't we, about these certain sacred cows that can't be touched. I think a big part of it for myself is that the most interesting story of almost any superhero is the origin story, right? How they came to be sort of what they are, or their kind of big main villain fight.
Yeah.
And everything in between that is just sort of superfluous. So of course we hark back to the 60s and 70s. That's when most of these characters were created. That's their origin. I think that's shown in how popular Ultimate Spider-Man was. And
yeah, all people wanted was to be retold all of Spider-Man, but without having to read stuff that's got that painful dialogue that's also in a narration box, that's also in a thought bubble that you can also see in the artwork. People just wanted the streamlined version of Peter Parker.
Exactly that. And I think that just goes to sort of show that the origin will always be the most kind of harked, wanted bit.
Yeah.
Telling somebody here's issue 627 of Amazing Spider-Man is not gonna.
It doesn't help people, and
not gonna endear them.
But I've argued this at length before. I'll forward you the files if you really want them. I do believe the best comics ever have been written in the last 20 years. Yeah,
It's a bold statement.
but equally, I think it's a constant knock-on effect. I think if you look back in 20 years' time, the further you get away from 1963, as an example year, the safer the distance you have, the freedom you have to not cite the first comics as the best comics. Like, okay, I know a lot of people love a lot of 90s books, but there's a lot of bad comics in the 90s. It's the same with any medium, I guess. But
I think I'm always cautious about calling anything like the best.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I know I'm being over the top with the best comics from the last 20 years.
But I mean, if they're the best to you, then that's absolutely valid. But, you know, like, I respect yours, Matt's, and Angela's opinions on comics, but we don't see eye to eye on everything. And you know, what actually represents the best is ultimately just an opinion.
Yeah, of course. I guess part of it is when you get into comics as a reader, and what you decide to start with is always going to reflect on how you feel about comics. I know that when I found myself getting seriously into like superhero books, I really liked the weirdos and the underutilized. I loved Booster Gold and Blue Beetle.
Blue Beetle, they're your boys.
And stuff like Steel, and there's just characters that don't get the screen time. And I remember the first time I found out Ambush Bug existed, and it's just like, man, the fact that you can make Ambush Bug, who is a, you know, man who's out of his damn mind with a super-powered costume from space that's just a fancy dress costume, and he's just concepts like that as a teenager I was like, well, I did not know this is what comics could be. And the fact that I know people who are then like, oh, have you been reading Superman? It's like, no, man, but have you read any Blue Beetle recently? I think it's warped my view, and I can't look back at like super dark 90s and 80s Batman and care, because I'm like, yeah, but what was Booster Gold doing in like 1989? I bet it was awesome.
Yeah, that's it. They exist. I think there are also different tolerances for people as well. Like, it's hard to go back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and probably a lot of the 90s without seeing types of art or story beats which are just distasteful now.
Yeah, I think there are things that have aged horribly, and
like Fantastic Four between 1963 and probably about 1983 was one of the most, like, hands down sexist books that you've ever read. Like, Sue Storm is treated like absolute dirt throughout a good 20-year chunk of Fantastic Four.
And she still is in the films, so that's a tradition that's alive and well.
Despite clearly being the best of the four. Never mind, So yeah, I just think what you consider best, or what you want to get from comics, is a real wide plane. And for me, I'm with you. I think modern comics are doing more for my taste and what I want than anything beforehand. Not anything, but you know what I mean.
Done a lot from before.
Done a lot, yeah.
So I think that's a nice enough place for us to wrap this one up. Don't know what your stance is on that. So, Will, thank you for joining me. And people out there in the ether, thank you for listening. We've been Bigger Than Capes. And remember that comics is bigger than capes.
Bigger than capes.
Yeah.
I always forget.
Bigger than capes.
Give me some of that sadness.
Yeah, I was looking forward to it, and then I watched it.
Oh, right.